Hello, everyone. If I can get everyone's attention. Hello, and welcome to the Open Book Festival and the panel on power, patriarchy, and desire. My name is Wanelisa, and I'm going to be chairing this discussion or facilitating this discussion. And on the panel, I have Zukiswa Wanner, who's the author of, just make sure, I've been reading the book the whole week. Love, Marry, Kill, and then I have Hamza Koudri, who's the author of Sand Roses. Then I have Busisekile Khumalo, author of Rubies and Rain. Welcome to the discussion. And just to thank you for your work. I've just been engrossed in your work the whole week. So I feel like I've been in conversation the whole week with your work. It's wonderful. And raises very important questions around patriarchy, around women's bodies, around the post-colony. So I'm excited to be in discussion. The first question I wanted to ask was, what is your personal relationship with power? You know, the subversive, the coercive, and institutionalized power. And, you know, what has been your journey with power, and how has your journey influenced your first novel? So I'll start with you, Busisekile.
Thank you. Wow, the first incident that comes up is my almost arrest when I was in Harare. I was in college at University of Zimbabwe, and we had gone out clubbing with friends, my first and only night out clubbing. And then because I stayed in campus, so I asked to leave because our campus by midnight, if you're not there, they lock you out. So around 11 p.m., I was like, okay, I think I have to go now. And then as we were looking for cabs, you know, because I was a student, the first one was like $30 US, and it was a lot. So my friends were like, no, let's look for other cabs. We continued looking for cabs until we got one that was saying $15 US. And just as we're saying, okay, fine, let's get in, suddenly, like, we're surrounded by police. And they were like, it wasn't even loitering. They said we were, what do you call that when you're prostituting and you're soliciting?
Soliciting.
Yes, they wanted to arrest us for soliciting. And I was wearing just as I'm wearing this, I was wearing my University of Zimbabwe badge, you know, and it stated that I was an LLB student, right? And I was like, how can you say we are soliciting when we're just literally looking for a cab? They're like, oh, you act as if you know the law. We are the law.
We'll
We will
show
you now. Just because you are learning, we are the law. And so it was, they dragged us to the Harare Central Police Station. They took our fingerprints, and I was scared. My friend was crying, so I had two friends. One was crying, the other was quiet, and I was just pissed, you know. And so they were like, oh, we want to show you. Exactly, because you are a law student, so you think you know better. And so I think it was a power trip for them, you know. And I ended up having to call my professor, Maduku, at around 1 a.m., and he called the commissioner, and it was a whole thing. And around 3 a.m., they were like, run, you know, run. And we tried running through a door, the three of us at the same time. So I think it really struck to me that how people can just abuse power, you know, because we weren't soliciting, we're clearly just looking for a cab. We're not dressed provocatively or anything. I don't know how they got to the soliciting part. And in the novel,
Are you sure you weren't soliciting?
well, I wish I was that adventurous, but no. So the novel Rubies and Rain, they actually arrested and detained unlawfully so, you know. And even though mine wasn't as as dramatic or as harrowing as Vimbai and Ruby's time in prison. It's just, I think it did inspire a bit. Like, that's the coolest story I have. Literally, that's my cool story. I was almost in jail. That's.
Thank you. How's that?
Sorry, there's no such cool stories. But I think the word power, so having been born and bred in Algeria, the word power in Algeria, it has such a big weight and presence in everyday life. The word in French is pouvoir, and it's a word you hear a lot because it almost symbolizes everything but nothing. It's almost, it refers to the system, the government, the military, the police, but it's always that sort of like form of oppressing power. And one reason people use that without sort of being specific is because they can, they get to criticize anything they want without really getting in trouble because, they're just criticizing the power. They're not really criticizing anybody, so they won't get in trouble for that. And so actually just recently, 2019, it was a year-long movement of protests. Every single Friday, people went on the streets and protested, men, women, kids, families. It was sort of a whole sort of event. They protested against the power. And then one other reason it's the power and not anything specific, because I think over the years and sort of generations, there's always been some kind of system in place where somebody has taken power from some source of legitimacy. Either, for example, from religion. For example, the 90s, there was a civil war, and religion was the sort of legitimacy for some people who claimed that power. At one point, it was the people who got us the independence, so that legitimacy always, is sourced from that. But then, not long ago, but in the sort of like, and going back to my novel, is it's set in the colonial times, and so the French used civilization as a source of claiming that kind of power. And each of those people would always sort of try to impose and coerce, and they're always trying to impose a way of living, and they always tell you what to do, how to behave, what to look like. And so, Algeria today is a little bit of, sadly, almost like there's a lot of xenophobia, and stuff like, there's always an alignment of how everybody should behave and act and say. And everything that's foreign is a bit sort of almost like a threat. And I think that's sort of like the result of all of those sort of like, people or sort of powers taking over. And so in San Roses, I try to portray that a little bit, because also at the heart of it is these dancers who are victims of sort of like layers and layers of that sort of coercion, because they're victims of, of class, but also patriarchy, but also colonial powers, and I think that sort of creates almost like a crossroads of oppression in a way.
Power. Well, I think about the rates are putting us to level 8, and therefore my having to take a long time to write my last book. Okay, no, on a serious note, I don't really have like that solid of a story on that particular one and how it affected the book. I was really trying to write with Love, Marry, Kill, something a little lighter after the heaviness of my last novel, which everybody was like, oh my God. Yeah, so I wanted to get back to the light me from the first novel, but I do have a Zimbabwe Republic Police story, which is that some years ago I was walking while holding a court of lion by State House in Zimbabwe and in Harare, and the policeman rushed to me and said, and he looked at me and said, hey, and he was speaking Shona, and of course I can understand Shona because my mom is Zimbabwean. And I pretended I couldn't hear anything. And then he came to me. Fortunately, I had my passport. And he said to me, and I said, oh, are you talking to me, officer? And he said to me, yes. And I said, how can I help you? And he said, well, you're not supposed to drink here. I said, oh, I'm sorry, I'm from South Africa, I didn't know that. Oh, you're from South Africa, yes. What are you doing here? Oh, I'm visiting your beautiful country. You know, it's not true what South Africans think about this country. I wish every South African would come to this country. It's gorgeous. Oh, where have you been? No, I went to Victoria Falls, and I'm going to Nanga. You know, Nyanga. Yeah. I'm going to go there. Oh, okay. Let me just wait here with you, madam, and I will. You can finish your drink, and you know. So that's exactly what happened. And I've noticed in a lot of countries where there's a lot of power play from the police. If on the African continent at least, if they think you're from outside, and there are certain countries that have passport privilege. South Africa, for all our Afrophobia, we have a lot of passport privileges in a lot of countries. So in Kenya, I always say, oh, this is my first time here, I didn't know. In Zim, I do that. And I'm always in fear that somebody's going to be like, hey, Zooks! And then, then I'll be screwed.
I have to say, you know, like, one of the things that I really enjoyed, and I don't want to get emotional, but the movement, you know, in the 3 books allowed me to kind of move and also go to Algeria, you know, and I think for me it was kind of a breathing out after the type of violence that we've been witnessing with Chidima. And so I just wanted to thank you for that, because it just made me feel like someone who was kind of a little bit paralyzed by that situation, but also just so outraged by the violence, you know, that was so public, to just be able to just be in conversation, but also to just move in my head through the streets of Harare, and, you know, also through the streets of, you know, Algeria. And so thank you so much for that. In the beginning of your novel, Zuki, you talk about, Owam talks about how, you know, when men make bad decisions, it's placed on women. And in different ways, you know, Salima, Fahima, Vimbai, and Ruby, and Owam, they have the responsibility. You know, men do make certain decisions or do certain actions, and it's placed on them, you know. And I was just thinking about that, and I wanted us to kind of have a conversation about the contradiction of patriarchy and power. We've been talking about power, and how, you know, there's a grab for power and a coercive power, but at the same time, there's a alluding of a responsibility that then is placed on women's bodies. And I just wanted, you know, when you were writing, you know, what was your...
So I think it's that particular beginning stemmed from a keynote that I did for African women, African women, young African women at universities in the US, and I think it was in 2021. And you know, it's really how so often, you know, like maybe like a man cheats on a woman, and then it's like, well, you know, it's the way his mother raised him, like constantly, or if a young woman, and she talks about it as far as, Owam is talking about it with regards to sexual violence, and she says there was an uncle, and this is a borrowed, actually, this is one of the things that actually I borrow from my own particular life. Where an uncle in exile in the movement. Anyway, in the movement, there was an uncle, and this uncle was a well-known rapist. Except they said he loved dresses. And so when we're kids, they used to say to us, if Uncle Banbani comes and we're not home, don't open the door for him. And we're children. And I'm thinking about, you know, as I was reflecting on it while I was writing the book, I was thinking, you know, if at that age we had opened the door and he did something, he raped us, we would have been saying, but we told you not to open for him. The responsibility was then put on us. similarly, when we're kids and we're in Zim, we'd be traveling and then maybe walking to school, coming from school. And we'd always have, you're wearing school uniform. And you'd always have, invariably, you'd have these men in cars who hoot at you, and they'll stop the car and they'll pull in or whatever. And, and I'm thinking, if we'd been tired and we got in the car, and something happened to us, then it would have been our fault.
Why did you get in the
We had teachers, and we still have teachers in this country, who are raping students in primary schools, in high schools, and where these children end up becoming parents, but they don't get prosecuted. And the reason maybe the family won't get them prosecuted because the teacher is buying food for the family, and if he goes to jail, what will happen to that family? And nobody takes responsibilities of that. But even the conversation about the young girl who gets pregnant from the teacher, who is raped, because that's what it is, it's always, the conversation is like, this one, she was too loose, she was attracting the teacher, she always sat in front of the class with a, so always the responsibility is put on women and girls, for the actions of men. So that's essentially where I was coming from with that particular. But actually, it's a very funny book, so it's not always this serious.
Hamza, I really enjoyed Sand Roses, and at the end of the book, you talk about how the book is centered around the dancers in the City of Joy, and in the end, you say that this is a history that is very contested, and it actually has been erased. And it has been erased, for the sake of the post-colonial national consciousness and the identity of Algeria. And so I was really interested in, for you to just kind of elaborate on that, like on the story, and also how it challenges the national identity and the national narrative, and how has that affected the book, you publishing the book right now?
Sure, and I think really the spark, the idea for Sand Roses came when I stumbled upon this podcast by a French historian who was talking about something completely different. I think the podcast was like prostitution in Algeria in the colonial and Ottoman period. And so she's talking about mostly Algiers. And then in passing, she would say, well, this is different from the old sort of models, just like the Oulad Nail dancers and the geishas of Japan. And then she moves on. I'm like, wait, what do you mean? Like, I've never heard of this. Like, in Algeria, you hear of the Oulad Nail tribe, sort of a tribe of great beauty, but you don't hear the story or the history behind sort of like, and then when I researched it, I found that there was a point when they were very popular. National Geographic once had an issue dedicated, I think half of the issue was dedicated to Busada, to the City of Joy. They at one point went to Chicago for the big fair in, I think, 1893. They would travel with the circus. They were really, really popular. They attracted tourists from all over the world. I was like, how did we go from there to, okay, we're not talking about them. Nobody knows the story now anymore. And so, as I dug into it, I found, of course, then, there's two views, and both of them were very annoying to me, because one of them is very Orientalist, almost fetishist, like mostly from the French or sort of like European, photographers or painters who had that sort of view of, almost like the harem, and sort of like this is an enchanting, exotic place where you go and see these women. But then on the other side, there's a lot of Algerians. Anything that I found from the Algerian side were either in denial, to say, no, this did not exist. This was the pure production of the colonial system trying to tarnish the reputation of the pure Algerian
revolution.
people. This was before even the revolution, even the people, but definitely, the revolution too. And then what I found out is also at one point in history, so in the 60s, there was a conscious effort to integrate them into the agrarian sort of revolution that was going on there. Still, they continued to work, but then in the 80s, it became dangerous for them because of the fanatic sort of like, and then the civil war that was going on in the 90s. So at that point, it was just dangerous for their lives to continue to dance. So they just, now we don't know of them. They've disappeared. But then as I dug into it, you see, they're actually still fresh in the memory of the people. As I talk to the historians, especially people from Busisekile, from the city, they say yes. Or some generations who talk to older parents, some of the readers come to me and say, we've had conversations with the parents, with grandparents, and they still they remember a time when these dancers used to live. And so all of that sort of pushed me to really sort of almost excavate sort of that history and sort of write a story about the dancers. And that's why it was also very important for me not to fall within each of those views, the Orientalist or sort of the denial side, the conservative side, but I tried to tell as much as I could an authentic story from the point of view of Fahima and Salima, the dancers. And it was very important for me that these are dancers who were there to make money, but to also have a good time and have a career. And I was trying to make sure that they had lives of their own. They weren't pushed into it in a way. Nobody's, I'm not trying to justify it or sort of apologize for it. I tried to make them very unapologetic about their way of life. But also to get away from that. Okay, I didn't want them to be those exotic sort of creatures that everybody sort of is fetishizing about in a way. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, and how and having published the book, what has been the response in taking into consideration these two?
Well, what's funny is every single event like this in Algeria that I've had, I would talk for an hour, and then somebody would raise their hand and go yeah, but this isn't true. They never existed. But also, I've been lucky because I've never had to defend myself. There would always be somebody in the room who said, no, I am from that region, and my parents remember that. I have pictures of that. And so they're like, okay, I don't have to be the one defending myself. But also, I think I've been, one lucky thing is because I published it in English, so it's not super accessible. And people who read in English tend to be a little bit more open-minded. And so now with my Algerian publisher, we're discussing, she's like, should we look into translation? Should we look into translation into French or Arabic? But, that could sort of spur other sort of, forms of reactions. So we'll see.
Okay, thank you. Busisekile, I wanted to ask you, I was listening to an excerpt of an interview you did with Cheeky Natives, and when you made an amazing point around, particularly heterosexual relationships, and the need for women to locate their desire and sex and pleasure outside of the male ego. Yeah. And I'm wondering, in your book, how do you think Vimbai and Ruby and maybe also Nosihle do this?
Okay, yeah. I do really advocate for sexual pleasure, especially for women. And I do talk a lot about women owning sex, especially in a country like Zimbabwe, where sex is still viewed as something that is done to women and something that can either add or devalue a woman, and it's a very cultured and very, and I always like talking about sex in front of people just for the shock, especially when I'm back home, because it's really funny that we have such a huge population and we don't want to talk about what brings the population. How are we having all those babies if we're not talking about the baby making? And so Vimbai is very bold, and Vimbai, I make it intentionally so that even in the first book, she has about 3 different sexual partners in that book, and she has others that she alludes to or mentions, and she's not apologizing for it. And for her, sex can be transactional as well. When she wants something, she gets a job from Chiropa because they had sex. And she does this and that. And because for so long, when a woman has sex, it's like it's something that is done to you. It's something that you must lie there on the bed and wait for the men to do to you. And I always tell women that, you know what, as much as we talk about men failing to give women orgasms or whatever, we have to also say, what am I doing for my pleasure? You know, why don't you ever just throw that man on the bed and ride him and do whatever you need to do to get, because men are like that. Once a man reaches his peak, it's it for him, you know. So why can't we do the same? And it's always, because it's your body, you know your body better than any other man. And so is my daughter? Oh, okay.
Yeah, is that the girl who's crying over there?
Yesterday she walked in when I was talking, so I'm like,
I'm riding.
How'd you go?
so it's always that. So yeah, in the book I do talk about that. And Ruby is actually bisexual, so she falls both sides, and she views the intimacy of her first lover, Tendero, and then she's now, as she, you know, she comes to South Africa where, you know, homosexuality is not something that is hidden, or yes, it's acceptable, and she meets Peaches, and she's introduced to toys. Hey, now Ruby is like, you know, this thing, and she has Cheropa as well, you know, and it's all about, they are very sexual beings and they enjoy sex, although at times it is used as a weapon against them. But I also give them that autonomy to to make those choices of enjoying sex. And there's a line that I like a lot from Vimbai when she's talking about Nosihle, who had a sugar daddy, but she says that's a waste of sin. How can you date a married man and give him sex and still not get anything out of it? You know, that's a waste of sin. And so there's these girls, they're young and they're experiencing their bodies, and I want that for women to say, okay, you know what, I don't want you to feel ashamed of your body count. Even if it's 30, 100, it's your body mass. This thing can produce babies. A whole head can come out. So a little penis is going to cause it damage. How? When it can, you know. So there's, I go into it, and yeah, I can talk the whole day. I can talk that.
Yeah. Thank you. No, good points. Good points.
Actually, because she touched on toys.
I'm flustered, guys.
All right, shall I help you?
Yeah, take it.
Okay. No, I was just, and this is the only way I'm going to help you, because she mentioned toys. There's a little incident where this character, her child, goes to school with her sex toy because he doesn't know what it is, and he's like, look what it does, you know. So the principal is walking on the playground and sees the child with a sex toy. So takes the toy away, calls the mom, and says, yeah, your son came to school with a toy, and she says, so is that why you're calling me? Yeah, I had to confiscate it. And say, oh, okay. So what's the point? Well, yeah, ma'am, I'm not sure. This is a bit embarrassing, but it was a sex toy. And so the mother says, okay, yeah. So I will leave it at reception in an envelope for you. And then she is embarrassed, but then his ending words is, please make sure you keep your toys far out of reach of children.
Yeah, I love that. That was like super funny. But I want to have a conversation about to move from a very lighthearted conversation, but it's in all of the novels, all of you take us on a journey from kind of childhood, or late teens into adulthood, into womanhood. And it seems to me there's a kind of a metaphysical death that comes with womanhood. There's various ways in which we die at various points in our lives, and you can see it in different ways. But what happens, within the metaphysical death, is that there is a woman, or there are other women who show up in the story and kind of breathe his life. Like with Owami, the best friend, when she was having a breakdown with Vimbai and Ruby, the prison, they find each other there amidst the violence and amidst the death. And I'm just wondering, what that teaches us about, the spiritual and the cultural legacies of African womanhood and solidarity. That even though patriarchy kills us in many ways, that there are other women who we find along the way who breathe life into us. And so I wanted to just, kind of give life to that. Anyone can.
I think one of the things that I grew up, most of my friends were boys, right? And it wasn't from a place of, I feel like I had this label, papa, I was very outspoken, very brass, and very boyish, so to speak. And so a lot of my friends were just boys. And in the back of my mind, I had this ideology that girls don't like girls, And then as I transitioned into womanhood, into being an author, being a mother, the people who have carried me through those stages have been women, And so I moved from being a boy girl to being a woman's woman, And I realized that women are pitted against each other, There's this point where even a mother and a daughter, that relationship is often strained, where you find that, and women often brag about it, like, no, my daughter doesn't like me, she's her daddy's girl, and I'm like, like, you are the mother, you sort of have that, you should bridge that gap between you and your daughter, instead of us then always fantasizing or always making it a big deal that girls need their fathers. Girls need their mothers more, because yes, your father can protect you, but your mother has gone through everything that you will go through at some point of your life, And because there's always that gap, I feel like, especially with us, if we were to sit down with our mothers and actually ask them, who was your first boyfriend, what happened, and this and that. But our mothers don't tell us that. They don't tell us how they met our fathers.
Listen.
They don't tell us.
Our mothers only had sex when they were conceiving us.
You see? And so there's always that friction and tension. But if there were to be that openness between women, I feel like we would be even further, and there would be that understanding and that empowerment that comes with a woman breathing life to another woman, because we go through almost the same thing, and there's no problem that is new under the sun. I always say this, there is nothing that we're experiencing now that the women who came before us didn't experience. But when we isolate, and I see it in these fights on social media, petty fights between Ama 2K, Nama 1990s and 1980s, and there's women, old women, 1980s, trying to shame these little girls. There was this interview about...
Did you just say 1980s old women?
No.
Can we pause there?
My cheeks like twitched.
No.
In rage.
No, I say it because they shamed this little 2000s, ne?
Yeah.
And so someone from 1980 and someone from... You're old. You're old now. You should know better than to be shaming. And here's the thing why I'm saying you're old. Because you're shaming them for the very things you did.
Yeah.
But there was no social media back then to out you guys.
Yeah.
So now you feel like, hey, I'm at 2000. They're very loose. Forgetting that you used to ride for free the taxis because you'd open your legs. But no one was filming you then, So I always say, when I see this fight...
Are you safe after this panel? Like, I feel like... Are you safe, girl?
Folks, She's joking. Buy the books, they're really
I'm joking.
entertaining.
And you are also young, 98.
You're very young. You're all very youthful.
Do you have something?
I mean, first, I think just attending the first session when Karen said pussyfooting and it was a big scandal, and being on this panel now, I feel like that was very strange. No, but I mean, I think just to go back to your question about, I think, women's solidarity, that was a big thing that I think I worked a lot in San Rose, because I received, at one point in one of the versions, actually quite a few people read it and said, there's a lot of women in the characters, the sisters, and we talked about this yesterday, the whole sisterhood, and I think a couple of people at least were saying, in a world of women like that, you have to put in extra competition, you have to put in extra viciousness, even between the sisters. And I can't lie, I did add a little bit of that, but also it was very important for me to capture some of that solidarity, because I think especially in that setting, in the place where, it's a colonial period, there's a little bit of resistance, and I think around the world when there is a period like that, usually the men go off to fight, but the women don't just stay back, but they have their own fight and their own resistance, and they only have each other to take care of each other and to back each other up. So we have, for example, really early on in the story, the two sisters, part of the whole sort of ritual is they would sell the virginity. There is a virginity bid, and we see, it's supposed to be one of the sisters, Fahima, but Salima, even though she's really annoyed by her sister, she doesn't really like her, but at that point, she's like, she can't take it. It has to be me. I'm going to do it. And in a way, sort of, she's taken all of that, speaking of almost like, the death, the metaphysical death, that is almost like a death for her, and like a sacrifice. She's sacrificing in a way, like her life for her sister. And especially in the Algerian context, and I know also like in other places in the world, I think, the women were a big part of the resistance all throughout. And actually, in a way, they had an advantage because a lot of times they were, people would not take them seriously. They wouldn't see them as a danger. And that's also a common theme in San Rose is, nobody would expect a dancer to be, I think, in a way that's sort of like, our villain is almost like, misled. Like, this can't be the dancers.
Yes.
And that was also like, there's a very popular story of a fighter in the 50s during the War of Independence who not only was a woman, but also she was very white passing. And so for so long, she was able to just go and bomb things and do everything, against the French army, and they would never take her seriously. They would never expect it was like quite a few times they would actually find a sort of like a place where all of the fighters were hiding, and they would actually take her to safety, thinking she's French. And she started to take advantage of that. Like the enemy, they raid that. She'd go like, oh my God, the Arabs, they're gonna kill me. And so the French soldiers would arrest everyone, take her to safety, and she would go on and continue fighting. And it's that side of, I think, I think a lot of the times they're underestimated. But I think just them sticking together is really integral to the success, I think, of a lot of these resistance movements.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to open up the floor for some questions for people who might have questions before we close. Okay. Can you wait for the mic?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the panel. This has been great. I really like what all of you have been touching on, especially in terms of othering. I'd be very interested, how do you write about your subjects to give them agency, acknowledging the fetishization, but then also challenging that and then saying, yes, it has been fetishized, but this person has agency, they have autonomy over their body. Sorry, it's not really a question, it's more like, can you build on this?
Okay, so I think what I personally do is I like the idea of making complicated characters, and so before I even start writing, I'll have an idea of what my character, how old are they, where do they grow up, what do they like eating, how tall are they, how short, etc., how dark, etc., etc. So I do all that, and the reason I do that is because that when I start writing, there's an authenticity that then just comes through by itself, because there is a person who grows up in Etumakala, in the Eastern Cape, will not have the same type of language as somebody maybe who grew up in London and then moved to Joburg or Cape Town, that type of thing. They have a very different feel on what they do with their lives. So, and their experiences of life, and even maybe their experiences of sexuality and sex. I'm pretty certain that if I go to my village in the Eastern Cape and I went there with a sex toy, there would be some. What is this? What are you doing? Is it a man you cannot find or something?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Okay.
Another question.
Oh, there's a.
Oh, you want me to? Yeah, I could respond, but I felt like I talked too much. So, but let me try and keep it short. Okay, so for me, before I write, I have to hear the voice of the character, which is a very weird thing to say out loud, but the character comes to me before the story. For instance, I know this character, I can hear their voice, I can, they talk to me, and then I sort of build a story around the character. And so whichever direction I try to take the story, the character is the one that has then to push the story. And yeah, before I get admitted, I'll stop it there.
No, I think very quickly, I think for me, it was really important to portray these women who not only dance for work and for money, but they really love dancing, and it's been part of their dreams all along, because they grew up around these ideas and hearing stories of other dancers who made it successfully. And one way you see that is, even when they're not being watched, they like that, and they enjoy that sort of act. And also, when speaking of sex, it was also very important for me to give each of them the sex they wanted, and not just sort of like, they don't do it as a job, but each of them has their own love life, and they have sort of those experiences, intimate experiences that they enjoy. And I think that for me was important, because then you're not just saying this, they're not forced into this, they're not apologizing for it, they're doing it because they wanted to do it. And I think just a little bit of context, this is a culture where these dancers were raised from young age to entertain and sing and dance, generation after generation. So it was very much sort of part of their culture.
Okay. Hi. Yeah. So, firstly, before I ask my question, like I was born in the 80s, and I. No, wait. No, it does. No. Sorry. Can I say? But I agree with you that I am too old to be fighting with a 17-year-old. Yeah. Like I really am. My daughter's 17, so. It would just be crazy. So I agree with you, right? Yeah, we may not be old, but we are too old to be fighting with and in competition with 17 and 20-year-olds. Yeah, so I agree with you. All right, and I think the thing that interests me about all of your stories, especially when it comes to desire, is how you write about now this sounds like a really old way of saying things, but the opposite sex. I'm sure there's a contemporary way to say the opposite sex, but yeah, I can't think of it. Yeah, but like Zukiswa, like how you write about like the male characters, right? And how they approach sex, how they approach relationships, what they think of their partners, and so forth and so on, right? And then in yours as well, talking about women and their desires, their lifestyles, and yeah. So I wanted to know a little bit more about that. Like, how do you get get into that mindset? Is it like stories that, I know with you did like a lot of research, but when you bring out that very story and that very experience, like what is it exactly centered on? And do you actually believe that that's how they think?
Oh, it was start. Okay, thank you. No, I think that's a very good question. And I think for me, not only was it difficult to write from a point of view of two women, but what made it even harder is these are two women who are completely different from anything that I'm familiar with. They lived in the 1930s, they had no education, they grew up sort of like in a semi-nomadic environment. There isn't a lot of documentation around that. So a lot of it was sort of like me with a torch in the dark. But I think what I try to center it around is a basic human experience. And so like you said, I did do a lot of research, but what was super helpful for me is just having a lot of, beta reader feedback. I was very, very lucky to have, complete strangers, but also friends who read it. And the first time around, I did get a lot of things wrong. And they would say, no, this isn't how, because I was trying to go, this, going through a period, going through pregnancy, going through, sex. So
you should give birth after like 4 months or something. In the first draft.
I know, like 4 months, something like, this isn't, think about that.
It's not that painful.
I swear, I think one very important comment, I think one person at one point, like, even panicked Salima panicked a little bit too much over her period. So one of my friends was like, maybe cool it down a little bit. It's not that big of a deal. But I think that was important. And I think, but also like other times I was asked to lean a little bit more towards it. So like, there was once a rape scene, quite a few of those, which was also equally hard to write because also I didn't want to be sort of almost capitalizing or commercializing sort of like violence against women. Yep. But in this context, I really believed it was important to capture that. And so at the beginning, I did feel like I was holding back, and people were, even my editor was saying, let's lean more into that. And that scene specifically is probably the one I worked on the most. Like, every single revision, I would add a little bit more to it until it was a bit painful for me to write. But yeah, I think research and beta reader feedback was very, very important to me.
For me, it's not the first time that I've written the male voice. And living in a patriarchal world kind of helps because men have the narrative, and you often see, and they generally make the judgments and stuff. So, I did that with Men of the South, and I've done, also with like London, Cape Town, Joburg, and I did that with this as well. And yeah, so I don't know whether I'm still like technically chick-lit now or whether I'm dick-lit now, because but I also very much with first draft, I get better readers of different demographics, and one of my better readers was two of my better readers were guys, and two were women. And so the guys were like, oh, can you tease this out a little bit, not too much though, but they generally were like, oh, okay, yeah, this is very me, this is a guy I know, this is, so I didn't really have to do that much research, because I often hear the male voice being elevated everywhere I go.
That's a very good point.
And that's probably the reason why there's a man who's never named, despite how often he appears. Yeah.
I'm gonna take the last two hands that I saw. Sorry, because we need to start closing. And if you could ask it just very briefly, and then we'll go again to the next question, and then we'll answer them, and then I'll ask the...
Okay, this question is directed to you specifically. First of all, hearing you speak about the double standards of sex was very vindicating. I was like, ugh, I'm not crazy. But living in Africa, being Pan-African, you feel that way because you face both systemic and social opposition from those views. And I just wanted to know, from a pro-woman woman to a pro-woman woman, how do you cope? Like, how do you stay sane with being opposed in your whole life?
Well, mostly I just don't care. I feel like people are entitled to their opinions, but then that doesn't mean I have to live within those opinions. And I say this as a recovering people pleaser. You know, I've been a people pleaser my whole life, and I only really started living for me, I think, towards my 30s, you know, when I realized that the people that I tried so hard to please were nowhere to be found when I needed someone in my corner. And I had to rely on myself. And I was like, oh, if I have to rely on myself, why don't I just live the way that I want to live, think what I want to think? And it's not to say that I always think I'm right, but there are some core beliefs that I will die on. Like, I don't care what you think about it. I will always say, never fake your orgasm. You know, if he's not doing it right, just lie there like a fish so that he just knows. You know? And that is just the hill that I'm willing to die on. Those are just my core things. And so that's how because, you know, at times we do all this arguing, especially on social media, right? You have to choose your battles. There are some women who only argue from a place of hurt, who argue from a place of they experienced a certain thing, a certain abuse, and for them to feel better, they can't acknowledge that it was abuse. So they raise it as culture, they raise it as religion, but it was abuse. And so now I have to see, okay, you were hurt, and you might be triggered now, but that's okay. I will live my truth. And if it triggers you, then get a therapist or something. It's just.
Okay. The last hand.
Thank you. I'm so intrigued and would really love to buy your books. I'm curious, I was hoping you'd touch on something that's a very big power in Africa in different forms. And I see the panel is very diverse. I'm hoping Algeria also will bring a different perspective to this. The power of religion and how it's woven with patriarchy. How does religion affect you guys in writing about sex and women? How does religion affect your characters in you talked about somebody moving down and experiencing that they're bisexual. I started wondering issues about what was their, I'm a Zimbabwean as well, who's come down to South, you know, and how, yeah, I'm wondering how does that, and spirituality and faith, so not just religion, how does that transition from affecting you in your writing to affecting your own characters and how you have them journey through their own sexuality and sexual awakenings? Thanks.
Well, I went to Catholic school, and like any good Catholic, I stopped going to church after I finished high school. So it doesn't really affect me, but it's something that I manage to at least play with my character because, and I've seen this with a few of my friends. Some of them are still in marriages. Some of them have got divorced, where they, at the point in time, things were not going well in their marriage. They started going to church a lot, and you know, they were told they were not women of Proverbs 31. You know, and obviously, if he's cheating on you, there's something that you are doing wrong, and if he's doing this, you must pray for your marriage. You know, and so one of my friends, who is a scientist, is a doctor, you know, was telling me a story about when she, like, her husband was like all over the show. They're divorced now, and she said this guy would be out, and she would be like in the middle of she'd wake up and it's like 2 a.m. She set the alarm and she's praying to bring my husband home. Yeah, because all the women in her church were telling her, listen, at least he's coming home to you, you know? So and then she said afterwards, she was like, you know, and then afterwards she slapped herself. what the hell is wrong with you, man? what is this? You know? So she is still very much, she is still religious. She goes to church, but she's just like, she has found her own relationship with her God, you know, so.
Yeah, I also don't go to church, much to my mother's dismay. But a religion, especially from Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe is a very Christian country, and with the way things are going wrong, maybe, I don't know. You know, because if we pray that much, and it's been 30 years, maybe different prayer, I don't know.
Maybe you need to stop having passion Java.
So yes, I was brought up also in a very religious home, baptized. My baptized name is Elizabeth, you know. I went through the 9 years of Christianity, but as I grew older, I always had questions. So I always questioned Christianity and religion a lot. And my mother actually forbade me from studying divinity in high school because she thought it will make me not go to church. Wow. Jokes on her, I still don't go. So it does really have that effect of saying when you're talking about sexuality and women especially, and I noticed that whenever sex is brought up in the terms of religion, it always seems to conveniently only affect women. When we speak about the spiritual entities, your spiritual husband, if you sleep with more than, but you are supposed to keep yourself pure for a man who has slept with I don't know how many other women, but if you masturbate, then you have a spiritual husband. You know, so it didn't make a lot of sense to me, and so when I write about these things, but I'm very conscious of, you know, the social upstanding of when I set a book. And it does affect, I think there's a part where Ruby says there's a speech, which was a direct quote from our former president, where he said homosexuals are worse than pigs, right? So that was an actual thing that a Christian said about other people, that homosexuals are worse than pigs. And I quote that in the book, and how it affects how she then loves. You know, she loves, but it's from a place of guilt, from a point of guilt and from a point of fear as well. And also we have Unosihle, the church girl, who, you know, she was a very good girl who just happened to fall on the dick of a married man. And she's still judgmental. She's still very judgmental. Even after that adultery, she's still very judgmental. And so it does affect the characters in how they think and how they pass judgment. But it really doesn't affect me because I'm not really, yeah.
Cool. Amen.
Hamza.
I just realized there's a kid in the audience, and I apologize for everything we've said.
We hope you are covering her ears.
Yeah. But to answer the question, I think in Algeria, Algeria as a society, as a community, has traditionally gone in and out of conservative religion over the years. And so now it's pretty moderate to conservative, maybe a little bit more moderate in urban settings, a little bit less so outside of the city. But what fascinates me is it takes very little time to move from one state to the other. So we see pictures just from the 1980s where, you know, you'd see bikinis on the street, people are having a good time. You know, it's very rare to find, actually it was very, very rare to find a woman who covers her head. But, you know, my mom, actually, she talks about in the 80s when she wanted to cover her head, she had to sort of hide it from her dad, like, because he would not let her go with him. If, you know, so she'd always be pretending to be like wearing like a fashionable scarf, you know, like, you know, high boots, but, you know, she's really covering herself, but, you know, she doesn't want to be portrayed as a woman who's like, you know, a religious woman. And then very quickly went into the 90s with fundamentalist Islamist movement, where it became dangerous for women to be out like that on the street. And then that became the norm. And for me, the story that I always tell a lot is it didn't even take long enough for driving licenses to expire. So like my mom and her generation had driver's licenses, they were driving around, and then before they even expired, it became a taboo, and if any woman drove, she was considered as a prostitute. And I'm like, this is the same generation. You don't, you just look into your bag, you still have those driver licenses. Now it's not so much the case. I mean, everybody drives around. But I remember like my cousin was the first one in the city, like, in a small little town who drove, and she had the reputation of a prostitute because she drove a car. This was like, late 90s, early 2000s. But in San Roses, one question I really struggled with is what was the religious beliefs of these women? Because they clearly did not sort of comply with, modern day religion. And until I had a conversation with the historian who was from Busada, from the city. And he was saying this was a time where there was a lot of ignorance. There was people who were traveling around. So really religion was more of a superstition than actual religion. So they, for them, he says, if they see a plastic bag wrapped around a tree, they would, think that's a good omen or bad omen. So and then so they would be making a lot of these trips that are more social than anything else. They'd be, gathering around and sort of, for good, good luck and stuff like that. And then we see in the scene also like at one point where in the novel, at one point where they try to bury one of the dancers, and then so they go to the mosque and they judge them. They don't want to sort of be associated with that, and they go to the church and they also sort of like send them away. And so it's really that question is like, okay, what do we do with this body in a way? And that thing also about judgment, I think one scene that ends up, being quoted very often, and I didn't mean for that, is what it basically says, we're all prostitutes in a way. And so like, it's one of the dancers where she says, yeah, why do they hate the prostitutes? Because they're selling their values for money, but who isn't doing that? And, they think of examples of like, the religious men who go to their tents for pleasure. They're selling their values in a way. The jeweler who's making jewelry for them is a Jewish guy and his wife is very sort of judgmental, but they take their money for that. And so, she has all these examples of all the people who are sort of like, judgmental. So, I don't know if that brings a little bit of diversity, but that's all the way across the continent. That's how it is.
Yeah.
And sorry again.
I just 10 seconds just to close off. I wanted to ask a last question, and if there's anyone in the audience who is at the brink of like giving up writing that manuscript, what would you say is your North Star? The thing that you hold dear and to be true, that strengthens you when you're writing and going through the dark soul, or whatever you're trying to finish. What is your North Star that like keeps you going until you've published?
Sex.
Hallelujah. Hallelujah. I don't know if mine is any better, but money. Like, I always think one day one of those books is going to be turned into a movie and you're going to be rich. And that's money.
Sex, money, Hamza?
Sorry, it's a bit cheesy,
Rock and roll.
No, it's cheesy, but honestly, the writing itself, and I like that. I think, at one point, if I am drawn into a little bit more administrative stuff, I'm not enjoying it as much as if I'm actually engrossed in the story. So it's easy to say it on this end of the publication, but it is what it is. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And
Thank you,
please buy the
Wanelisa.
books. Please buy the
you.
books. They're wonderful. Wonderful books. Thank you.